Chapter 4. A dark tunnel. A weak, regular gust of wind blows through it, pushing along a few loose pieces of rubbish. It all rattles along, the rolling, gentle cacophony highlighting the vast emptiness. There is a light at the end of this tunnel, but it is a light of another world, overcast and apathetic, one which wouldn't understand the inhabitant of this tunnel, nor could it. Even this remote place, however, would be ruled by the strong. It was an inevitable eventuality. The man in the tunnel hadn't come to the light. It came to him. In the half-light where he had resided, he had seen it. Two lights cutting through the dark. The conductor looked upon him with surprise, then pity. Pity at the fact that this thing was living here. The train hit him, but he did not die right then. He was merely broken. These gusts could echo on for years. My face had been cupped in both of my hands. I would gingerly crane my neck back and forth, rubbing my face for a few moments, coming out of my dreamlike trance. Finally, I looked at him. His face was all turgid, but not as swollen nor destroyed as I had imagined. It was more the texture that was off. His skin had been all creased and leathery before, tanned, but of an overall normal hue. Now his skin reminded me of an eggplant, taut on his face, fragile. You could imagine breaking it simply by pressing your fingernail into it. His nose was really the only thing that was noticeably out of place. I had broken it. When I got closer to look at him, I could still see some particulates of blood on his mustache. No one had cared to get it all out. His facial hair was plentiful and wiry, graying in odd patches, but over half of it was still a dull brown mixed with ginger. In the spots where it was short, it gave the impression of porcupine needles. I expected him to look absolutely miserable. He did, but hardly any different from before. Looking at him now was a mundane experience. The only surprising thing about all this was the fact that he was in a coma. I felt sad, but not the way you should be sad for having done something like this. In fact, I could hardly even directly pinpoint why I was sad. It was just the color of a passing mood. Don't get me wrong, I felt bad for having been the final straw, but I was just that, a footnote in this story. I looked at the door. It was closed shut. I hadn't faked my initial response to the doctor. It was shock, and that was enough for him to have believed the sincerity of the supposed familial connection we had. I leaned over him. Even now he smelled of the decadence of alcoholism. "All this for Raccoon?" I whispered. I glanced at his heart monitor. His pulse went up. He had heard me. It was then that I felt his presence in the room. He wasn't just a breathing corpse. I was here with a man. I stood there amazed at this realization and backtracked in my thoughts. My cynical, dark, human thoughts. By now I hadn't expected to get anything out of this experience. Not even a little, but the weight of it all. I wasn't that far gone. That had not been me. I looked down frantically, first to his face, then to his body. His hand. I took his hand in mine. He had once been a worker. I could tell due to its ruggedness, its largeness. It reminded me of my father's. Mine had not been conditioned and hardened, but I was much stronger. His years of poor choices had weakened him too much to even contend, but in that moment I felt weak, and all I could muster was a squeeze of his fingers. "I'm sorry. It isn't right. It will never be right." I looked to his face, trying to find something, but there was nothing. I believe he could hear me from behind the veil, but not much else. For a moment I saw not a man, but a child. He looked miserable, but he wasn't. He was at peace, in oblivion. My words floated by and had mattered for a moment. Then they didn't. Looking back later, I would often find different aspects to this instant, small nuances, but I would always see the child, not the dilapidated vagabond with a raccoon. I would find no answers with him, that much was apparent, and he had already heard me. There's nothing more for me here. I know he wanted me to leave as much as he could still want, but I no longer felt that repulsion towards him. He was not the other. I took a deep breath and put the Whitmans on the table in his room. Perhaps Timward, or whatever his name was, would enjoy them. I thought for a moment. I hadn't touched anything in this room besides the man and the box of chocolates. I picked up the box and tore the plastic wrap off of it, careful not to touch the cardboard box with my fingers. As I was doing this, I noticed a crumpled post-it note on the table. It had probably fallen out of his clothes at some point, and a nurse had placed it here. It was just a website address. It was probably not very important, but it caught my curiosity. I set the box down and with my left hand snapped a picture with my phone's camera to look it up later. Finally, I approached the door, and with the plastic wrap still on my right hand, I opened it. Coming in, the doctor had opened and closed it for me, so my prints were not on it. I looked back at the man for a moment and left without a word. I breathed out a sigh of relief. Closure. I was leaving this all behind. I would never forgive myself for what I had done, but at least I had the balls to come here and look this man in the face. I had done it intelligently, too, but my carefulness at avoiding leaving any prints seemed somewhat absurd to me. I had been incredibly paranoid in a situation where, quite frankly, it was unlikely that anyone cared. I was wrong. People did care. The man I had nearly slain, as I found out later, was beloved in the community, and there had been, as it turned out, enough outrage for the cops to put more than a preliminary effort into attempting to track me down. As I was walking down the hallway, I felt my adrenaline surge. Someone was looking at me intensely. It was the kid from the gas station. What was he doing here? He looked at me with great surprise, but he clearly recognized me. He was excited to see me, but he was being firmly led by his mother and thus couldn't immediately get at me. I sped up as much as I could without running, and I was already at a four-way intersection when I heard the high-pitched squeal of the teen telling his mother who he just saw. I turned the corner, but I had made the wrong turn. There was practically nothing here, just the men's bathroom and a service elevator. I glanced up at the hallway mirror, and my stomach dropped even lower. The kid was standing with his mother and a cop motioning to another officer that I went down the hall and turned right at the intersection. The cop was already barreling towards me. I spun on my heel and faced the bathroom and elevator. I had precious moments to act, but there was clearly no escape. But I had to try. I had been so close, it couldn't end like this. My first instinct was to go for the elevator. I slammed the button with my fist and I looked up at the indicator. It was at the top floor. There wasn't enough time. The bathroom was the only place I could go, but what was I hoping to accomplish? There was nowhere to hide here. They'd know that this room was the only one I could have possibly gone into. Hell, I had made it even worse. They would notice the press elevator button and deduce that I had gone to the bathroom when I realized I didn't have enough time to duck into the elevator. The bathroom was empty. I wouldn't even be able to try to confuse my pursuit by being part of a crowd. The situation was totally screwed up. Still, one last Hail Mary. I went to the last stall, the one at the very end up against the far wall, and closed the door. For a moment I wanted to lock it, but I realized that locking it would just tell the cops, I am here. In my last-ditch effort to save myself, I climbed on top of the toilet. I was of standard height, but the stalls were tall enough that when I leaned against the wall, you wouldn't be able to see me. How childish. They would laugh at me for this. This was your best effort to hide? Seriously? They'd laugh the whole way, call me a joker at the police station. I would look a total fool. Maybe it is better to surrender myself like a man to avoid the embarrassment. Suddenly there was a loud and utterly disgusting fart, followed by the sound of defecation, then the smell of the whole mess. There was someone else at the other end of the bathroom. I hadn't noticed that one of the stalls was occupied. He huffed and sighed out deeply. He sounded so relieved and pleased that I could sense that he still believed himself to be alone. He flushed just as the cops entered, 2 of them. They were clearly cops. They had the heavy gait of authority. 2 knocks. The whole scaffolding of the stalls vibrated. "Sir, finish up and come out." It was the voice of a black man, confident and proper, but with the clear undertones of someone who had grown up in the rough part of town. The other cop was more impatient. He paced faster. "We are seriously going to play this game?" The man in the stall was utterly shocked, but not immediately intimidated by them.
"What the fuck? I have IBS, the worst shits of all time. The Hurricane Katrina of bowel movements, the Pompeii of the toilet bowl."
The cops laughed hard. This was going to be quite the story of the station. I nearly laughed too, but I was too wound up to do anything but stand in fear.
There's probably someone else here. It's a public bathroom.
The cops sighed. They had to humor this fool. Slam. Slam. They were throwing each door open. They were going to find me. What was I going to do? I wasn't going to be saved by circumstance again. Why do we have to do this? There is no one else here. The door next to mine was slammed with a harsh cracking thud which made me jump slightly. I had now positioned myself propped up against the wall with my feet just gripping the side of the toilet bowl, trying to make myself as small as possible. This story was about to have a tragic end. My door was pushed open.